This hour of Hugh Hewitt starts right now on Salem News Channel.
Good morning, America. David Sachs is one of the big four funders and activists from the West Coast in the Republican Party, joining Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and Keith Kroc. But David is sort of different. He introduced Ron DeSantis on the site formerly known as Twitter, but he's a little bit skeptical of him now, and the neo-isolationists have a voice and a very strong influencer in David Sachs. Listen to our long interview today on The Hugh Hewitt Show.
You won't want to miss a minute. This hour of Hugh Hewitt is on Salem News Channel.
Join now. Glory, America, bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt, live in Studio North. Overnight, the Fifth Circuit upheld restrictions on the abortion pills. A run on an entire country, like a run on a bank. China is unfolding before our eyes. Interest rates are skyrocketing in the United States, and suffering continues on Maui. I'll cover all that breaking news, but I want to begin with an interview I conducted late yesterday afternoon on the West Coast, early evening here on the East Coast, with entrepreneur, Silicon Valley venture capitalist, podcaster, and GOP influencer activist David Sacks, whom you may have heard when Ron DeSantis announced his campaign on Twitter with Elon Musk and David Sacks. David is a huge critic of aid to Ukraine and the unfolding of that policy and of traditional Republican national security elites in Washington, D.C. We had a long conversation, which I'm going to play throughout the show today, beginning right now. Joined now by David Sacks of Craft Ventures and the co-host of the All In podcast, as well as a big presence on Twitter. Hello, David. Thank you for joining me. I'm very glad you did.
Good to be here. Thanks, Hugh.
Now, I've spent a lot of time with some of your friends like Peter Thiel, and I just got off an hour-long interview with Tristan Harris of the Center for Humane Technology. Are you familiar with Tristan?
I don't think so. I'm not that I know of.
Okay, well, I am only learning about the All In podcast, and I listened to the Vivek interview with great interest because I interviewed him yesterday. And then I listened to the Bill Gurley interview with even more interest. But I have a problem. I don't know your voice yet. The only time I'd ever heard your voice was on the Twitter thing with Ron DeSantis. It was so choppy, I couldn't get a good. I've been doing this for 33 years, but I still couldn't get it in. When you were doing biographies, which was really the most interesting part of both podcasts, somebody said they liked Shoe Dog, Man in the Arena, and Hamilton. Was that you?
I don't know. Let's see. No, I don't think so. Wait, a voice said that those were, those were books that they liked.
Biographies. You guys were talking about biographies.
Yes, I think that was a friend of mine, Brad Gerstner, who was also on the pod. So yeah, no, unfortunately, that was not me.
Okay, so tell me what biographies you read, because I actually think it's one of the most interesting questions you can ask somebody.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a bunch. I don't read as many as I used to. I guess probably the best biography I read. Well, I really like Gore Vidal's Lincoln, which is historical fiction.
I like his Burr, even though it's counterfactual, but I like Burr.
Yeah. I like the First Man in Rome series, actually.
We are soulmates.
Yeah.
You know, why is that not on audiobook? You can only read them twice. I could listen to them endlessly and get the pronunciations done. But that's a 7-book series, which is fabulous. It's all Plutarch and Tacitus made real. So that's a very good, interesting thing.
I love that series. Read it. It goes from Marius to Caesar to Augustus, that whole sort of last century, the Roman Republic.
It ends with Augustus. Yeah. And after that, if one goes off, you can read further. But historical fiction does a very good job. I'm curious. Have you read any of Churchill, like the 3-volume Manchester book?
Yes,
Churchill?
I was going to mention that. The Alone book, the one from, was it like 1933 to 1940, basically, talking about the wilderness years. Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, and I was going to mention that book too.
The reason I bring that up is because I'm very familiar with your stance on Ukraine. And I think if Winston Churchill could channel in right now, he would say, you're forgetting the Sudetenland, you're forgetting the Anschluss, you're forgetting Munich, David. You're forgetting everything I tried to warn Neville about, and before him, Stanley Baldwin. How would you respond to that ghost?
Well, I mean, this is always the neocon argument, is that it's always.
I'm not a neocon. I'm a Reagan conservative.
Okay, well, let's just say that this is always the argument that you hear, is that it's always 1938, that our enemy is always Hitler, and engaging in any diplomacy whatsoever would be akin to appeasement, and you're Neville Chamberlain. And so this is what I've been hearing throughout this war. And what I would just say is that every historical circumstance is different. I think, I'm very familiar with what happened in World War II and what led up to it. And I just think that the situation we have today really bears no resemblance to that. I don't think the idea that that Putin is Hitler is a serious argument. I don't think that this is primarily a war of conquest. I think the causes of this war have been known for decades, which mainly has to do with Russian security concerns, which the West continuously ignored. We ignored the advice of George Kennan in the 1990s in bringing NATO right up to Russia's door. He predicted that would be a tragic mistake that would end in hostilities. We ignored the advice of our own ambassador to Moscow in 2008, Bill Burns, who's now the CIA director, who told us that expanding NATO to Ukraine was a red line for the Russians, not just Putin, but the entire Russian elite. It was absolutely a red line for Gorbachev and Yeltsin, as well as various liberal reformers inside of Russia. We ignored the advice of Kissinger and Professor Mearsheimer in 2014, who warned us we were headed for this war unless we agree to make Ukraine a neutral country. And instead, we ignored all of this advice for many years, and we persisted in this crusade to bring Ukraine into NATO and basically turn it into a giant military base on Russia's most vulnerable border. And not surprisingly, Russia reacted quite negatively to this, as was predicted many times over the years by all the experts I mentioned, including many others. And yet we persisted in this policy. And the results now have been disastrous. We're in this war. It's going very badly. I think the war is an absolute disaster for Ukraine. I think that the administration was pinning its hopes on a successful counteroffensive. Remember the narrative we were told for the whole last year, or at least certainly since the fall, since Kharkiv, was that we were going to arm the Ukrainians. We appropriated over $100 billion to them. And the idea was that we would have this successful spring counteroffensive. The Ukrainians, with the help of American armor and weapons, would punch through the Russian lines. They would scatter, they would turn tail and run, they would be disorganized, they were demoralized and ineffective and corrupt. And that within a period of even 3 to 4 days, you'd see significant progress. And within a couple of months, the Ukrainians would be at the Sea of Azov. They would cut off the land bridge to Crimea, and the Russians would have to sue for peace. And that was going to be the end of this whole matter. Well, obviously that hasn't worked out. Where things stand today is that the counteroffensive has moved incredibly slowly. Even publications like CNN and the Washington Post, which are incredibly pro-Ukraine, are admitting that the reports from the battle lines are sobering, that the losses have been staggering, that the Ukrainians have made little progress, and there is no serious prospect for them for retaking territory in a serious way. So what you're starting to hear now are words like quagmire. You're starting to hear words like this is going to be a multi-year war. They're already giving up on this year. That now they're planning for next year, and once again the United States has found itself in another quagmire. So and not to mention that Ukraine's just been completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Over 10 million of their population are now refugees. They've had to flee the country. The infrastructure has been destroyed. The economy has been destroyed. And again, they're not retaking this territory. So I think at some point we're going to have to recognize that we are going to have to do what we always needed to do, which was engage in serious diplomacy to solve this conflict. And sadly, we're only going to recognize that fact, I think, after this country is completely destroyed and the West has basically fought to the last Ukrainian. So let me stop
David, I always
there.
like to tell. Well, I like to tell my audience, it's not a debate. It's an interview. I want to know what you think and why you think. I get 3 hours a day, 5 days a week to tell people why I think we ought to arm the Ukrainians, so I don't need to debate you. I want to know what you think. Vivek was on Wednesday, and he told me he wants Let's pause it there and come back and pick it up there. The David Sachs interview will be throughout the morning. It's already posted in its entirety at Highly Concentrated Hugh over at iTunes, if you just want to listen to it uninterrupted. But there is news happening every step of the way, and I want to remind everyone, especially of our sponsor, Food for the Poor. Food for the Poor is doing great guns, preparing for what is going to be a god-awful hurricane season. One of those partners with Food for the Poor is Carla. Here is Carla in El Salvador.
We're talking about pre-positioning, blue sky planning for when a disaster hits, whether it's one of the 17 countries where Food for the Poor serves. These are people who don't have safety nets. In Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti, when
Colorado State University predicts the worst hurricane season in 20 years with 18 major storms. So Food for the Poor is doing the smart thing and pre-positioning disaster relief. You can help. Thousands of you already had. $100 is a single box. You can give 200, 400, 500, 10,000 is the biggest gift we've gotten thus far. All of it welcome at the banner atop of HughHewitt.com. Come right back for more of David Sachs after this. Think and why you think. I get 3 hours a day, 5 days a week to tell people why I think we ought to arm the Ukrainians, so I don't need to debate you. I want to know what you think. I want to know what you think. Welcome back, America. I'm going to continue my David Sachs interview in the next segment. It's already all posted over at Highly Concentrated Hugh on iTunes if you want to listen to it. But I do want to update you. Former President Trump released a campaign video yesterday, cut number 5.
One of the most important issues in this campaign will be who can rescue our country from the burning wreckage of Bidenomics, which shall henceforth be defined as inflation, taxation, submission, and failure. Under my leadership, we built the greatest economy in the history of the world. In fact, we did it twice, and when I get back in the Oval Office, we will do it again, and it'll be bigger and better and stronger than ever before. On day one, the Biden economic bust will be replaced with the historic Trump economic boom. Any numbers you see that are economically positive in the Biden administration are because they're running on the fumes of what we created years prior to their taking office.
This is a good approach by the former president, and it does not focus on his legal troubles, but those legal troubles are going to follow him everywhere. Mike Pence, the National Conference of State Legislators yesterday, cut number 4.
Now this week comes another indictment regarding the former president's conduct in the days leading up to the close of our administration. I've said many times I had hoped the judgment about those days would be left to the American people and to history. But such is not the case. But in these times, I want to say I think it's important that we hew to first principles and that we tell the truth to the American people.
Ron DeSantis went on with Guy Benson last night on Guy's show to talk about the debate that is coming up on Tuesday, cut number 6.
So he owes it to people to go up there and debate. He needs to tell people, first of all, they're going to ask about, a lot of his unfulfilled promises from when he ran in 2016. For example, he's out there now saying he's going to do a special counsel to go after Joe Biden. Guy, I was at these rallies in 2016. The number one thing they would say, lock her up, lock her up. He said he was going to hold Hillary accountable. He got elected. 2 weeks later, he said, oh, never mind, we're not going to do that. He let her off the hook. So you have Republicans, including me, who've complained about a two-tier justice system, about how somebody who's connected to the D.C. elite like Hunter Biden can get off with a slap on the wrist and not be pursued the way they are.
You can see the whirlpool that is Donald Trump is sucking in all of 2024. My conversation with David Sachs has got nothing to do with it. It's focused on the other two big issues, which is Ukraine and technology. Tomorrow I'm talking with Tristan Harris about technology. But I'm a little bit in despair if this relitigation of 2020 consumes the entire campaign. I'm not as much as despair as investors in China. Today's market report is brought to you by Birch Gold, as it is every day. Go to hughgold.com or text my name, Hugh, to 989898 if you're going to buy gold or open up a retirement savings account. The Wall Street Journal today reports that more Americans have $1 million in their IRA and 401k and SEP IRA than they ever did, ever. Some of those are in gold, some of those are in stock, some of those are in cash. But I'm sure all of them, or almost all of them, got started 30 years ago, which is when you got to open up an IRA or a SEP IRA in your 20s and your 30s and do as much as you can. Some of that should be in physical precious metals. You're not allowed to hold that in your safety deposit bank. You need a third-party intermediary like Birch Gold. And you can find them by going to hughgold.com. They'll also sell you gold, and the strike price of gold today is $1,923 an ounce. It fell yesterday, as did everything else. The Dow was down 1%, the S&P down 1.16, the NASDAQ down 1.14, as the key 10-year Treasury went up to 4.29%. But the real story at the Financial Times, global investors dump Chinese securities as state support hopes fade. Reversal of flows reflect crumbling confidences and promise made by party leaders. This is a disaster for China. It is there. I've been saying for months they're looking at their own 2007, 2008 panic. It's beginning to unfold. I don't know how that will affect the domestic gold market in the United States. Gold bugs have always been worried about China and very leery of it, but it certainly is going to affect markets as you saw it did yesterday. Once again, Birch Gold via hughgold.com or text Hugh, H-U-G-H, to 989898. Time for my relief factor. And we went late last night, taping and editing and getting ready for today's conversation with David Sachs, which continues after the break, and for Tristan Harris, who was on Friday. So about 5 hours of sleep, and the voice isn't great. But I do have my relief factor, which doesn't help the vocal cords so much, but it will get me out and moving later today. Icarian, curcumin, resveratrol, omega. Take it every morning. And I trundle most days after the show. May take a nap today after the show. But I want to tell you, I'm in the ReliefFactor.com studio, and if you're watching on the Salem News Channel, you say, how beautiful that studio is. I know, I put this together myself. I mean, I hewed the wood. Mark the Digger didn't help me with this. Brian the Banker didn't help me with this. Two Speeds Tony didn't help me with this. George the Marine did help me with this, but mostly his wife helped me with it. This is a gorgeous studio. I wired it just beautifully because ReliefFactor.com said if you're going to put our name on the studio, we want it to look good. And then I get to put the books that I'm reading, like the Cobble book, in my back, where I get to put America's culture. Yeah, everything is on screen. You should be watching on the Salem News Channel. But ReliefFactor.com makes it possible. It also makes it possible to do 10Ks and 5Ks. Get out there and do the 10,000 steps, which is actually a mirage. 4,000 steps will do you. But you got to get started. You got to do something. And if your back hurts or your knees ache or your joints anywhere are a problem, that's just inflammation that's just getting old, or it's getting exercise. If you're just getting old, or if you've just got pains and aches that come with doing stuff, try ReliefFactor.com. The starter pack is $19.95. Come back, all David Sachs in the next segment of the Today's Hugh Hewitt Show.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Birch Gold Group.
Welcome back, America. Last night I talked to David Sachs, one of the most influential Republican activists and funders on the West Coast, an entrepreneur, co-host of the All In podcast, and we talked a lot about national security and focused on it. Let's resume that conversation. Vivek was on Wednesday, and he told me he wants to impose a peace in place and deal with Putin, disengage him from China. And we talked for 45 minutes. He had another engagement. And I didn't really get into the specifics of how he would propose to do that. Now, you're close with Governor DeSantis. Governor DeSantis regrets, I know, the territorial dispute. I don't hold that against him. I think he's talking about diplomacy at a more higher range. But in your mind, you've taken companies from zero to great success. How do you get from where we are to where you think we want to get to? I mean, just in your mind, what do you think happens here if someone adopted the David Sachs plan?
Well, I think that we're in a very tough position now because the deal that we can get today is not the deal that we could have gotten back in March or April of 2022. And it's certainly not the deal we could have gotten in mid-2021 when Biden had the summit with Putin. I think we could resolve this matter very easily. What the Russians were looking for, again, throughout 2021, and they made this really clear in a draft treaty they proposed in December of 2021, is the most important thing is they wanted a written guarantee that we would not bring Ukraine into NATO. Secondarily, they were very concerned about our placement of dual-use missiles, missile launchers in NATO countries like Poland and Romania. I think we could have negotiated on those points too. I don't know why we had to abrogate the ABM and INF treaties, but that's sort of a separate matter. But the main thing they wanted, their primary concern was about NATO expansion. And I do not think that it would have cost us much of anything to make that, to give them that assurance. But instead, the administration took the point of view that there can be no change, there will be no change, that we are committed to this idea of an open door policy for NATO. This is what Blinken said. And we categorically refuse to negotiate on the question of whether NATO's door would remain open. And yet today, after Vilnius, there is no prospect of bringing Ukraine into NATO. Jens Stoltenberg himself said that Ukraine would not be joining NATO unless and until they win this war. But there is no prospect for them winning this war. We are out of ideas, frankly, on how to help them. And so
David, if Ron DeSantis became president and he said, David, I want you to be my Harry Hopkins. You don't have to live at the White House, but you're going to be my Harry Hopkins. Go wherever you need to go to make the world safer for America's national security. Where would you go and what would you ask for?
Well, let me just say, to be clear, because you mentioned DeSantis a couple of times, I have supported him, and I do support him because I think he's done an excellent job in Florida. I don't
Superb. I'm neutral.
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that somehow I'm like a foreign policy advisor to him or something like that, because he has his own views and he needs to speak for himself on this issue. What I would recommend is, and I think Vivek was onto something here, is that one of the really negative consequences, one of the many negative consequences of our handling of Ukraine and this war is that we have absolutely pushed Russia into the arms of the Chinese. And China really is, being the only real pure competitor to the U.S. in the world, it really should be the primary focus of U.S. security. And, the strategy we should have pursued, and I think Vivek made this point, is it should have been more akin to what Nixon did with China, which is we always tried to divide the Soviet Union and China, not have them link arms. And notably, we tried to do that even though they were both communist countries. And, whatever you think of Putin and Russia today, it's the authoritarian nature of Russia today. It pales in comparison to the totalitarian nature of the Soviet Union or Mao's China back then. And so this idea that we somehow couldn't make a deal with Putin when we could make a deal with Mao, I don't accept that. I think there was a deal to be made. And I think Vivek is right that we need to stop pushing Russia into China's arms. Where I think maybe where he's simplifying is this idea that this is something we can fix overnight. I think the best we can hope for. I think the best
Vivek
we can hope for. Well,
Vivek is a very fast learner. He's a very fast learner, but he's still got a lot to learn. And he's drawn a red line around Taiwan, but he's going to erase it as soon as we are semiconductor independent. That didn't go over too well when I talked with him on Wednesday among the national security crowd, which you call the blob, and it can be sometimes the blob. You're absolutely right. But vis-a-vis Xi, who makes Mao look like a piker, Xi is our 1938. Putin is our 1914. And if there's a book called The Sleepwalkers by Kenneth Clark, which I'll recommend to you, David. But I'm going to go back. We are where we are. We can't go back in the Wayback Machine to 2 years ago. Tom Cotton said we could have deterred this completely by not leaving Kabul and giving it to the Taliban and inviting the Chinese in to take Bagram. I don't know who's right. We are where we are. So you're Harry Hopkins.
That's not correct. Listen,
okay.
Let me address that point. I mean, the rhetoric that you hear from neocons, and what I mean by that is hardline militarists, and I would include Tom Cotton in that. And look, I like Senator Cotton in other ways. Okay, I don't want to be.
Would you define hardline militarist for me?
It's somebody who perceives the world in a very hawkish way and wants America's first response to any international crisis to be militaristic versus diplomatic. And I would further say, and this is the point I want to make about deterrence, is that they have a tendency to think that any bad thing that happens in the world occurs because the U.S. failed to project power. In other words, it failed to deter. And therefore, the only thing the U.S. needs to do is be strong. And, and again, that every bad thing that happens is because somehow we were weak. I think that is silly. I think that that other nations, especially great powers, have their own interests. Some of those interests they consider to be existential for themselves, and therefore they cannot be deterred in a simple way from pursuing those issues that they believe to be existential for themselves. Furthermore, I would just say that this type of thinking has a horrible track record. I mean, look at where the United States is after 20 some odd years of pursuing this hardline, knee-jerk, militaristic, reactionary foreign policy. It got us into Iraq. It kept us in Afghanistan for 20 years. It got us involved in Syria. It got us involved in Libya. It's been one fiasco after another. Millions of people around the world have been killed. We have thousands of our own casualties and horribly wounded veterans suffering from PTSD to this day. We destabilized the entire Middle East, creating this huge refugee problem that persists in Europe. So this type of thinking has really done nothing but give us one disaster after another. And yet it's the same people, the same foreign policy establishment, and the same government bureaucrats who have administered and led us to the situation we have in Ukraine. This is, again, another neocon folly that, and maybe it'll be the last neocon folly that's been perpetrated.
Now, neocon it's a loaded word, and I don't like to use it because there are Reagan conservatives and there are neocons. The Reagan counter.
Victoria Nuland is definitely a neocon. She started as Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisor. She was arguing for Iraq, telling us lies like Saddam had WMD, was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda.
Not a lie. If you're wrong, it's not a lie, right? If you're just wrong. Because the entire foreign policy establishment, including Bill Burns, who you've spoken of, they all believed he had WMD. We were wrong, led to bad choices. But I want to go back to the end of the Cold War. Why do you think that
I think that when Donald Rumsfeld said things like that Saddam not only has WMD, but we know where they are, I think that has to be a lie. I think that was
It's not a lie. We disagree, but again, it's not a debate. I want to know why you think the Soviet Union fell apart. Was it because of Reagan's peace through strength? Because I think you said on the pod that you feared the military-industrial complex. Was that you?
Well, I'm certainly not the first to say it. Eisenhower said it, and he certainly knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, but he said it when Ike said that, we were spending 11.3% of GDP on national defense. We're spending 2.7% of GDP on national defense this year.
Yeah. Listen, I think if your point is that, do I believe in peace through strength? Am I a fan of Ronald Reagan? The answer is yes. But part of the reason why I am a fan of Reagan, and this is where I think his legacy has been misappropriated by some of the people we're talking about, is that Reagan at the end of the day was a peacemaker. That when Gorbachev came along and Margaret Thatcher told him this is a man we can do business with, Reagan sat down and made peace. And he ignored some of the hardliners in his own administration who who were too suspicious. And Reagan sat down and signed arms control treaties and made peace with Gorbachev. He seized the opportunity. Moreover,
That's
when the
actually
reform,
incorrect, David. David, that's incorrect.
You don't
Do you
think
know Reykjavik at all?
yeah,
Reykjavik. What do you think happened at Reykjavik?
We signed arms control agreements with Gorbachev.
No,
didn't
no.
happen.
It ended. It ended with Gorbachev leaving in anger and Reagan leaving in anger, and Richard Pearl, who was the Prince of Darkness, was there leaving disappointed. They worked on the bathroom tub. I was in the administration. It was an utter and complete failure, and there was no peace agreement with the Soviet Union. What happened in 1989, managed by George H.W. Bush, is that Reagan's SDI and the investment in American strength brought about a competition that the USSR could not win except for glasnost, but then they could not control glasnost once it began, and a totalitarian state fell apart. We didn't have to go to war. We did go to war in Grenada. We did supply the Afghans with weaponry to fight the Soviet occupiers of the Afghanistan Peninsula. He wasn't a pacifist, and he didn't do a deal with Gorbachev. So if you make that kind of if someone does a presentation to you at Kraft and they get a basic fact wrong, how do you respond?
I don't think you know what you're talking about. I'm just Googled INF Treaty, 1987, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
That's not
signed by the
Reykjavik.
United States. I didn't say it was
That's
Reykjavik.
not
Who cares about Reykjavik? We were discussing
Reykjavik
Reagan's
is when
legacy.
Gorbachev wanted Reagan to abandon SDI in exchange for significant cuts. The INF does achieve parity, but it did not do what Reykjavik proposed, and that was not making peace. The INF. What do you do if someone gets something?
We're debating tactical issues here of how Reagan brought about these agreements with Gorbachev. I don't really care about what happened at Reykjavik, what didn't happen at Reykjavik. My point is that when Reagan had the opportunity to make peace, he did. He seized the opportunity.
No.
Reagan was a peacemaker. 1987 INF Treaty. What am I getting wrong here?
That is fundamentally wrong. He would not give Gorbachev what he wanted. He did not mind the INF deal.
How do we sign that treaty?
Because we had deployed
the
there. The INF treaty is about short range and intermediate range missiles. It's kind of a nice step towards getting along. It did not make peace in our time, as I'll explain. And this is one of my issues with West Coasters. You got to know what you don't know before you tell me and the audience what you think ought to be done. And we're making progress, and it's fascinating. Stay tuned. David Sachs continues after the break.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Regnery's Life After Capitalism, now on sale from Regnery Publishing.
Pershing 2s. The INF doesn't.
We're debating tactical issues here of how
the INF weaponry Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, live in Studio North, keeping an eye on what may turn out to be a nationwide bank run in China as investors flee the country. But I go back now to my interview that I conducted last night with Silicon Valley investor and GOP funder and activist, podcaster David Sachs. And they get a basic fact wrong. How do you respond?
I don't think you know what you're talking about.
Audio?
I'm just Googled INF Treaty, 1987, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
That's not
signed by the
Reykjavik.
United States. I didn't say it was
That's
Reykjavik.
not
Who cares
Reykjavik.
about Reykjavik? We were discussing
Reykjavik
Reagan's
is when
legacy.
Gorbachev wanted Reagan to abandon SDI in exchange for significant cuts. The INF does achieve parity, but it did not do what Reykjavik proposed, and that was not making peace, the INF. What do you do if someone gets something?
We're debating tactical issues here of how Reagan brought about these agreements with Gorbachev. I don't really care about what happened at Reykjavik, what didn't happen at Reykjavik. My point is that when Reagan had the opportunity to make peace, he did. He seized the opportunity. Reagan was a peacemaker. 1987 INF Treaty. What am I getting wrong here?
That is fundamentally wrong. He would not give Gorbachev what he wanted. He did not mind the INF deal.
How do we sign that treaty?
Because we had deployed the Pershing 2s and the cruise missiles to Europe, and then we were willing to agree on limits on the number and types of intermediate nuclear range. But he first acted with strength towards Europe. And how do you deal with the counterfactual that he put arms? I
never said. I told you I agree with peace through strength. Like Trump says, I want our military so powerful we never have to use it. Obviously,
but he gave
strong.
all that weaponry to the Afghan Mujahideen. Now, we left and we screwed it up after the Soviet Union fell apart. But was that a good move by Reagan to arm the Mujahideen?
Maybe, but we did this in a completely different way than we're doing Ukraine right now. I think you're referring to Operation Cyclone. It was a CIA covert operation. We gave them stingers. We were not putting American flags on the boxes and the trucks that were delivering them. It was a covert CIA operation. We were very careful to not let that escalate into World War III. What we're doing in Ukraine is very different. We're giving them much more weaponry. We're much more involved. The weapons that we're giving the Ukrainians require them to be part of a tightly knit web of information services. They're using our satellites in space. They're using our targeting. You've had Biden administration officials bragging about sinking the Moskva, bragging about killing Russian generals, taking credit for that. They took credit for the successful counteroffensive, the Kharkiv counteroffensive last year. These were all articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Look, you're not going to get me defending the Biden administration. They completely screwed this up. usually by acting too little too late. That's where we disagree. But I want one more comparison for analogy's sake, David. I assume you're familiar with the Yom Kippur War because you're a student of history. Okay? So Nixon said, in order to save Israel, send everything that can fly. They were being overrun in the south by the Egyptians, on the east by the Jordanians, to the north by the Syrians, and Nixon sent everything that could fly but not American troops. What is the difference between sending everything that can fly to Ukraine and sending everything that could fly to Israel 50 years ago?
Well, as I recall, the Yom Kippur War was only 19 days. It lasted October 6th to October 25th, 1973. So if they were sending everything they got, they better needed to get it there pretty quickly because it was over in less than 3 weeks.
Hold on by your said Nixon saved Israel.
It was over in less than 3 weeks, and that's very different than a war that's already lasted a year and a half. And Biden is saying as much as it takes for as long as it takes. So we're talking about a multi-year war with Russia that could spiral into War III at any time. That's difference number one. Difference number two.
Okay,
hold on a second. Difference number two. Did I get any facts wrong there?
No, that's correct.
Okay. Difference number two is the role that Kissinger played. He brought that conflict to an end. He sought a ceasefire.
Oh, no. No. Nixon won that. Kissinger, in his book Crisis, recounts how he had to be brought into it. And I know Dr. Kissinger fairly well because of the Nixon Library stuff. Kissinger likes to credit Nixon and go out of his way with crediting Nixon, overcoming the Defense Department's unwillingness to send what were the anti-tank missiles, which were crucial to the win on the ground. But I don't want to defend Biden. Biden screwed it up, David. I want to know what Harry Hopkins...
Hold on. I think I need to finish making this point. There's no question that Kissinger and Nixon, the administration, played a role in achieving a ceasefire that then became a peace deal. And that was taken to the United Nations, and the U.S. played the lead role in bringing about that deal. And they did it in conjunction with the Soviet Union because neither superpower wanted this regional war to escalate into a world war. So they shut it down.
No, I don't. Okay? I don't want to hold against you because I ran the Nixon Library. You may not know this. The Egyptians were in full flight retreat, and the Israelis could have gone to Damascus, and we stopped them. That's why we got peace. Is that we stopped? All right, I'll stop it right there. We'll come back at the top of the hour. The combined analogy of Afghanistan and the Yom Kippur War explains Ukraine and why it is both strategically and tactically necessary to do it. But I'll continue the conversation with David Sachs. He has a very good response when we come back. I do want to remind everyone out there that you can listen to it on the podcast uninterrupted by commercial breaks and by me and my commentary. It's over at Highly Concentrated Hugh at iTunes. The audio is over at hughhewitt.com. We'll post the video as well at hughhewitt.com and on the YouTube channel. And give it another listen through because I can't emphasize for you enough that the emergent neo-isolationism represented most articulately by David Sachs and Vivek Ramaswamy is, in fact, a key debate in the Republican Party. And the Reaganites are not as loud, but they are more numerous. More coming up. Stay tuned to this Thursday edition of The Hugh Hewitt Show.
Portions of The Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Food for the Poor.
This hour of Hugh Hewitt starts right now on Salem News Channel.
Good morning, America. David Sachs is one of the big four funders and activists from the West Coast in the Republican Party, joining Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and Keith Kroc. But David is sort of different. He introduced Ron DeSantis on the site formerly known as Twitter, but he's a little bit skeptical of him now, and the neo-isolationists have a voice and a very strong influencer in David Sachs. Listen to our long interview today on The Hugh Hewitt Show.
You won't want to miss a minute. This hour of Hugh Hewitt is on Salem News Channel.
In the Sinai, we stopped their tank battalions advancing any further than the Golan Heights, and Kissinger then
He brought that conflict to an end. He sought a ceasefire.
Oh, no. Nixon won that. Kissinger in his book Crisis recounts how he had to be brought into it. I know Dr. Kissinger fairly well because of Nixon library stuff. Kissinger likes to credit Nixon and go out of his way with crediting Nixon. Overcoming the Defense Department's unwillingness to send what were the anti-tank missiles, which were crucial to the win on the Egyptians were in full flight retreat and the Israelis could have gone to Damascus and we stopped them. That's why we got peace. Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Hugh Hewitt live inside of Studio North. Keeping an eye on China, as the Financial Times tell us. Global investors dump Chinese securities as state support hopes fade. Could have a run, not on a bank, but on a country today. I'm keeping my eye on that and other headlines as they break. Last night I interviewed David Sachs, a Silicon Valley investor, entrepreneur, capital allocator, call him what you will. He's also a key influencer in GOP politics and a podcaster at the All In podcast, which he co-hosts. He's a very great Ukraine skeptic and something of a neo-isolationist, very smart guy. I chatted with him at length yesterday. Let's play part of that interview now. Is that we stopped Sharon in the Sinai, we stopped their tank battalions advancing any further than the Golan Heights, and Kissinger then did shuttle diplomacy for 3 years to bring about the deal under Ford. So it's not
right,
that
but
easy.
You're not contradicting anything I'm saying. What I'm saying is we played the role of peacemaker. Now compare Anthony Blinken's role in the current crisis compared to Kissinger. Blinken just gave a speech. Blinken just gave a speech saying that diplomacy was appeasement. He was actually attacking the very idea of diplomacy, which is his job in this conflict. Moreover, the West sent Boris Johnson to sabotage the peace process that we had at Istanbul, or I should say the parties had at Istanbul, that was on the verge of producing a peace agreement. So the Biden administration here has done everything possible to perpetuate this war and I'd say not only avoid, but sabotage a ceasefire and a peace deal. It is completely different than the role that Kissinger and Nixon played.
My suggestion is that you cannot get to the bargaining table about a lasting peace, whatever it would look like, unless and until Ukraine achieves strategic momentum. They might have been able to do it last year, and Biden blows everything. And you know what Robert Gates said. He's been wrong about every major foreign policy decision for the 50 years he's been in office, and Robert Gates is right. But you do need momentum on the side of the Ukrainians before you can do any kind of a deal. What I want to ask you, and what Vivek left unclear with me, is if Russia is winning, I mean really winning, what do you think would happen in Ukraine, and what do you think would follow a Russian win in Ukraine?
Okay, well, there's a couple of parts here. So first, I want to address the idea here that we have to be winning on the battlefield in order to make peace. I think that last year would have been the time to when I think the West and Ukraine had that successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv, and the Russians were a little bit on the back foot. That would have been the time to negotiate. And actually, General Milley suggested that. Remember, he came out. He was kind of went contrarian compared to the rest of the administration and suggested that the Ukrainians had achieved as much as they could on the battlefield and they should seriously consider negotiating. Well, we missed that opportunity. And the reason was that what the administration said is that, well, we're just going to win. You know, we're winning the war. We're on the front foot, and we're going to basically arm the Ukrainians for this spring counteroffensive. And then we're going to push the Russians out of Ukraine altogether. So when you're winning, according to the administration, that's not a good time to make peace because you can keep winning. And then when you're losing, that's not a good time to make peace because you have no leverage. So the fact of the matter is that in the eyes of these people who are conducting our policy, there is never a good time to make peace. And that has brought us to, I think, this disastrous point, which is the Ukrainians are losing on the battlefield with no real prospect of reversing what appears to be, at best case, a slow grinding war of attrition and a stalemate.
A 1914 situation. It's a 19, but I'm not willing to say they're losing. I don't think they're winning right now. And I think the minor advances they've made in the Donbass are not significant. And they've got to show a lot more to get momentum back. But to go back to the Yom Kippur analogy, it was a rout, David. The Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jordanians were in full flight retreat, and the Soviets were threatening to send in Soviet arms unless we stopped them. So that's when Kissinger stepped in after we had rearmed them. We're not there now, and I'm not going to defend the Biden administration, and Cotton doesn't either, and neither does Mike Gallagher. They're hopeless. They're completely bad. They do everything at the wrong time. They say the wrong thing, and the president is infirm and not in full cake. He doesn't really know what he's doing. I don't know if you want to comment on that or not, but I just don't think he's actually in charge. And I don't think Tony Blinken can run an apple cart, much less the Department of State. And I do not believe Lloyd Austin has a clue. Have you read this new book yet, by the way? Kabul by Jerry Dunleavy and James Hassan. Had a chance to read this yet?
No, I haven't seen that.
It is a catalog of error in the Afghanistan withdrawal, which makes me, it's the only book that's made me actually angry and sad at the same time in decades, because the level of incompetence once Biden and team took over from Pompeo and Trump and Robert O'Brien is staggering in the level of its incompetence. And we will get hit out of Afghanistan within 5 years by the Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K. Someone's going to hit us again, 9/11. What are you going to, if you're Harry Hopkins, I want to take David Sachs to being Harry Hopkins. What do you do?
About what? About which crisis here?
About the world. Right now, we're in a very perilous situation. China's poised to strike at Taiwan. That's Vivek's view. That's my view. We're in the Davidson window. We are in a quagmire in Ukraine. Our GDP is falling. We're on the cusp of a recession. You think 2.7% military spending is too high, but as Vivek said, we're down to 275 ships, and the Chinese have 450, and they're building 8 every year, maybe sometimes 12. We're not building anything. What do? We spend all the money on crap. The IFA is just crap. I don't know if you believe me or not, but the semiconductor factories are fine, but 90% of it is crap. What would you do if Ron DeSantis calls you up and he wins? And I'm not for anyone. I'm Switzerland. I might be doing the debates. It can be Trump, Vivek. They're all welcome here. I will ask them the nasty question. What do we do with this world? And what's David Sachs advised them to say?
Well, Hugh, we've set the world on fire. So the first thing I would do is act like a firefighter and put out some of these fires. I mean, you can't go around the world, destabilizing the world, being hyper-interventionist like we did in the Middle East. We destabilized the whole Middle East. We destabilized Ukraine. We basically we backed a coup there in 2014.
Were the Abraham Accords a significant achievement?
I think that was a meaningful achievement. I think Jared Kushner did a good job, and I praised him on our podcast for that. I think that was good.
I know, and so I don't think we destabilized the Middle East. I think we brought Israel and the Sunni Arab countries into the first entente that they've had in reality since the cold peace of the Camp David Accord. And I believe that but for Biden incompetence, we would have Iran on the ropes right now, and they would be begging for a deal. So I think we brought Iran on the ropes. But this team is the worst team in national security history, in modern times at least.
But here you're using this language like, we're in fights with all these countries. We got Iran on the ropes. We need to keep challenging Russia. We can't make peace with them unless we win decisively, which basically is a recipe for continuous escalation of World War III. Meanwhile, we really do have a peer competitor in China, but we don't have the resources to basically, or we should be pivoting to Asia, and that's been delayed indefinitely because of all these other problems.
Russia
so this
and
attitude,
Iran,
this hardline militaristic attitude has got us in.
Not hardline. I'm just a realist. I want my grandkids to grow up in a world where they're safe. I believe that China, Iran, and Russia are locked in an entente that resembles nothing so much as Austria and Germany and Italy, or Austria and Germany, not Italy, in 1914, and that we've got to do something.
We drove them into each other's arms. Those three countries don't have that much in common. Okay, Russia and China were not allies during the Cold War. There is historical frictions there. Graham Allison wrote a great piece in the Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs talking about the potential border disputes that Russia and China historically have had, and should have had, but we have driven them into each other's arms. They see
And China
us.
wants their Siberia back. Yes, they've got actually Chinese maps now with Chinese names next to some of the Russian cities. But Russia is the junior partner. That's basically a mafia state. That's not a Leninist state. China is the big boy. Iran is dependent upon China for all of their foreign exchange currency because of the Trump administration's hard sanctions. I'm just, you think that it's a risk game. And I think there's basically China, Russia, Iran, and everybody else. And everybody else better get their act together to contain, like George Kennan said. Not to go to war with, but to contain. Do you agree on that?
George Kennan told us we were making a tragic mistake in alienating Russia by bringing NATO right up to their border, which we didn't need to do. He said nobody after the Cold War was threatening each other. We could have worked out a security architecture for Europe that basically diffused any tension between Russia and the United States. And instead, we did the opposite. We ignored all of their red lines. We basically staged color revolutions in their backyard. We basically, expanded NATO over their many objections. We threatened to take Crimea away from them, which is the location of their major naval base at Sevastopol. It's basically their Pearl Harbor. We have no regard for any of their security concerns. And then when they react negatively to all of this, we invent this story that it's because they're somehow so belligerent and we can't engage in diplomacy with them.
Okay, stop it right there. We'll come back. David Sachs and I, different worldviews, but it's an interview, not a debate. All of it is on the podcast, Highly Concentrated Hugh, if you want to go listen to it now. And the video and the transcript will be at hughhewitt.com. I'm coming right back, though, to the Salem News Channel. Hope you're watching. Stay tuned.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by the American Legislative Exchange Council. Visit alec.org for more info.
Welcome back, America. David Sachs, one of the emerging influencers on the West Coast, funder, entrepreneur, capitalist, capital allocator, and podcaster. David Sachs joined me last night for a long conversation about Ukraine and all things national security. Let's pick that up again.
The main mistake the Biden administration made was not taking one of the many off-ramps to this war. We could have negotiated an off-ramp. Now we are stuck in a quagmire over there, and we still have this problem of China, and we still have Iran. So what I would say is, maybe your worldview needs to allow for the possibility of diplomacy more. If you want to put out some of these fires, we have to start using diplomacy.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I'm a Nixonian guy. I'm a realist. But I do believe that Nixon assessed very carefully, and he set in motion a 5-year plan beginning in 1967 and culminating in 1972 to do the flip the script with China. I think Hillary Clinton had that in mind with the reset button. I think Donald Trump had that in mind when it was undermined by the Steele dossier and by the Democratic Party. And I don't think it's now possible given who Putin is and the people he's surrounded by, but it might come back around again. But Iran is a revolutionary regime that will never do a deal with us. And they are in with China, which will never do a deal with us. So let's go to China, David. Can we agree at least that the American military expenditure on its Navy, which guarantees freedom of the seas and the rise of American capital and the rise of European capitalism, that we have to guarantee free passage of the South China Sea? Do we give them the South China Sea, or is that part of your diplomacy?
I think these are very tough questions because I do think that we have allies in the region. We do have interests in the region. Those interests are much more important than any interest we have in Ukraine. And I do think we have some real questions there. I am basically a realist, and I think that I think it does make sense to put together a balancing alliance in Asia to basically contain China to some degree. That is basically
AUKUS plus India.
That is balanced power
and Vietnam.
Logic. Okay.
Yeah,
I agree with that. But at the same time, I think we have to be extremely careful not to accidentally provoke a war with China, because that's the last thing we need right now. And I'm not totally convinced we would win that war.
I don't either. I think they've got 450 ships and we've got maybe 120 that are deployable. What would you do about Taiwan? Vivek wants to say to them, don't mess with Taiwan until we're semiconductor independent. You can have it. That is controversial, very controversial, but he said it on Wednesday on my show and it made the rounds. What does David Sachs think we ought to say and do about Taiwan right now?
Well, I think we just want the status quo to continue. The status quo has been very good for the U.S., it's been very good for Taiwan. And so we have the status quo of strategic ambiguity combined with the one China policy. It's a little bit contradictory, but we have managed to kind of, muddle through the contradictions. And I think that what we should do is to seek to continue that policy. I would not change it to strategic clarity. I know Vivek wants to do that just temporarily, but I think that would be extremely provocative in the eyes of the Chinese. I do not think we want to escalate the situation. I do not think we want to blunder into a war. I think that if we can maintain status quo and kick this can down the road another 10 years, like we've done the last 10 years, that's sort of a best case outcome for us. So I know that's
they have these giant roll-on, roll-offs, David, where they have outfitted basically giant ferries with the ability to approach an amphibious landing in Taiwan. If that begins to happen, and an American president was presented with the problem of shooting first, what would you advise them to do? Let them have Taiwan or shoot first?
It's very hard for me to see an American president shooting on a Chinese ship. I mean, you're talking about starting potentially World War III. And I think that, as we've seen with Ukraine, the idea that you can fight a limited war as opposed to the inexorable logic of escalation taking over, I think that it would be incredibly dangerous. Now, I'm not saying that we don't maintain the optionality. That's kind of the point of strategic ambiguity. I'm not saying that we have to definitively decide not to defend them either, but it would be, I think, it's very hard for me to see Americans shooting on a Chinese ship and starting World War III. So I think we don't want to find ourselves in that situation is the short answer. Look, we don't want
ambiguity. Stop right there. I will come back. That's not an answer. It's a beginning of an answer, and we'll continue with the answer afterwards. But Xi gets a vote, and Xi wants Taiwan, and the CCP wants Taiwan. We'll come back to that. David Sachs is a smart guy, has an answer. We'll continue with it. ReliefFactor.com is our sponsor. I want to give them their due, which is that they sponsor this studio, beautiful studio that's surrounding it. And I take it every morning in hour number 1, and I tell you about it now, and I'll remind you in hour 3. Don't leave home without it. Put it in a place you can remember it, and stay active, stay moving. If you want to be in the game at 90, you're going to be in the game at 100. If you want to be out there walking around and not lost in space and not having anything to do but sitting in your chair watching TV, stay active now. Get active now. Get ReliefFactor.com to help you do and stay active. It supports the relief of the minor aches and pains that come with exercise and aging. You're going to be doing the latter. You should be doing the former. The reality is really about 4,000 steps a day will do the trick. But I like to do more than that, a lot more than that. And I think you ought to be doing a lot more than that. Even in your 80s and 90s, I think you ought to be a lot more than that. And the healthiest people I've ever known are and do that. So go get ReliefFactor.com. Put all the clubs in the bag, do all that you can for yourself to make the round. But ReliefFactor.com starter pack is only $19.95, so at least give it a try at ReliefFactor.com. Coming right back with David Sachs. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. David Sachs and I continue our conversation about all things national security. Remember, he is a huge Ron DeSantis advisor and not, of course, in control of the campaign, but it's important to understand the emergent voice of the West, which I think David Sachs represents. Back to the conversation.
I think we just want to keep our options open. I mean, yeah.
If you go back to 1911 and 1914, whether you read Churchill or you read Kenneth Clark, strategic ambiguity was everywhere dominant. And when the German naval law passed in 1900, they began to build their fleet. Strategic ambiguity increased, but people began doing operations and they began planning for war, but no one was clear. Strategic clarity might have prevented the Kaiser from doing what the Kaiser did, and he didn't really understand what was coming, and they ended up with their Ukrainian hardline situation. I think strategic clarity makes a lot of sense, and that Vivek just went a little bit too far in putting a time limit on it. We've got to deter the Chinese, because what happens, this is where I really wanted to ask you, if they invade Taiwan, what do you think happens to the world economy?
Well, it's not good, but it wouldn't be nearly as bad as if the U.S. and China got in a war, right?
Yeah, but what do you think if we don't? I don't want to get in a war with anybody, but to deter China, we have to say a lot more than strategic ambiguity, and we have to build a lot more, and especially we have to build things under the sea that have the feasibility of striking and demonstrate cyber and satellite capability that do the same thing. That takes a lot more spending than we're currently spending. And what I heard on the All In podcast is you think we're militarist at 2.7% of GDP, and we're not even close to Reagan levels, which was, I think, 5.3% at the height of the Cold War.
Well, we're spending almost $1 trillion a year on defense, and we don't even have enough ammunition to give the Ukrainians. We're out of 155 millimeter artillery shells, so I don't know what we're getting for all this money. We're getting royally ripped off by the military-industrial complex. You know, people have been complaining since the 1970s or 80s about the Pentagon spending $500 on hammers and $800 on toilet seats and that kind of stuff, but now it's gotten much worse. Since the forever wars, we've been spending trillions on all of these wars that actually they're not even part of the budget. We spend $8 trillion in the forever wars of the Middle East. What do we get for that? Nothing.
All sunk costs. And you know as well as I do that sunk costs cannot determine going forward. $877
Yeah, but
billion
you can't keep incurring all of these trillions and trillions in debt for no good reason and then say, oh, that was just a mistake. That's the sunk cost. Don't worry about it. We shouldn't have any lessons going forward. We have squandered
we got to get
trillions.
lessons. The $877 billion requires changes to everything, including the triad. My first question to Vivek, the first time I interviewed him, if we have to cut one of the are you familiar with the triad? I don't want to trick you. It's not an ambush. Are you familiar with it?
No, I'm not. No, what is that? No,
it's the ability to. It's our strategic deterrent that is under the water, in the air, and in missile silos. We have 3 legs to the triad. Vivek did not know what it was, and he went off to study what it was because it's crucial to American national defense. The triad has always been what prevents nuclear strikes on the United States, and we've always had that capability. It is increasingly clear to me we can't afford all 3 legs, and I get the hawks mad at me because we can't afford all 3 legs. So I ask people, what do we cut? They're all 20, 50, $100 billion programs, and I think the one we need is under the sea, but I can't get anyone to focus on that. But 2.7% total is not too much. We're just not spending it right. So forgetting about
I don't necessarily
mistakes,
think it's 2.7%. So the U.S. Well, I mean, just to do back the envelope here, the U.S. economy is about $25 trillion, and we're spending. Yeah, it's like you said, 877 is the official number, but there's all these other costs that you could, if you add it in, you'd probably be at $1 trillion or more. Then you've got all these wars that are done off balance sheet. The Ukraine war is not being taken out of the Pentagon budget. By the way, that would be a much better incentive structure for our military-industrial complex. If you said to them, your budget is 877. If you want to spend money on defending Ukraine because you think that's the best use of American defense dollars, then take it out of that budget. But we don't do that. We just put it on the credit card. We just put it on the national debt.
And that is at $33 trillion. That is a nightmare. And the interest rates are going to go up, and it's going to bring a lot of chaos through the system. But if we had a national
look at our deficit. I mean, our deficits are well over $1 trillion a year. Okay,
and so 33 is going to be 40.
65%
is going to be 40.
Sorry, say that again.
33 trillion is going to be 40 trillion in 7 years, maybe.
Right,
5.
Exactly. We already have this massive debt that's already starting to increase interest rates, which is going to have a huge drag on our economy over the long term. But my point is, we're already trillion. We have at least $1 trillion deficits, maybe multi-trillion-dollar deficits already. And the majority of that goes to entitlements, which nobody wants to cut. And now we're looking at interest expense on the debt at about $1 trillion a year. And so when you say that we're underfunded on defense and we're spending $1 trillion-ish a year plus all these wars that we tend to get into as bonus spending, I don't think it's a small number. I think it's a massive number.
It's a very small number.
And I think they're ripping us off royally. What are we getting for all that money? Again, we don't have enough 155 millimeter artillery shells. We've run out of Stingers. We've run out of javelins. On and on and on. The reason we've given cluster bombs to Ukraine is we're out. That's the only thing we got left.
Your best examples, David. If you want your best examples, it's that 40% of our attack submarines cannot get maintenance, and that the LCS, which was our most recent commissioned ship, is worthless, and we're decommissioning it after 4 years. Those are your best examples. The Ford cost an enormous amount of money. We are terrible at this, but that doesn't mean we don't need to do it. We do need to do it. We need to do it better, and we need to upend the Pentagon spending and have better leadership. But I am worried about China.
Hugh, hold on. Hugh, I'm a businessman, okay? If the Pentagon were a company, what it would be doing is it would be going through its budget. It would be cutting costs. It would be figuring out what wasn't needed anymore. It would be questioning the wisdom of investing billions in things like aircraft carriers, which are total sitting ducks. The Chinese can take out a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier with some missiles that cost thousands. And we're seeing this asymmetry in
That's incorrect,
Ukraine,
David.
where you can take out a $5 million tank with a drone that costs a few $1,000s. So
that's correct.
We're spending the money on the wrong things. I'm not an expert on military systems, but it seems to me that our thinking on military systems is outdated. I think the procurement process is a disaster. You have this revolving door of the generals who do the procurement in the Pentagon. They all go retire and then join the boards of these defense contractors, and we're single sourced in many of these areas.
Your best argument is that the aircraft carrier today is like the battleship in 1940. It has many great capabilities, but they're not the capabilities that we will need in 30 years, and we've got to transition immediately, and we have sunk costs that are holding us from making radical choices. But all of that is true, but we still need to agree on a baseline defense budget, and I believe historically we've done at least 4%. And in doing that, you might be able to get reforms, but the Pentagon isn't a business. It's a bureaucracy run by the constitutional authority that's duly appointed, and you need Congress to do that. So you need politics to change. I don't think you get politics to change with isolationist arguments, and I think you're making an isolationist argument. Why am I wrong?
Well, I'm not isolationist. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any involvement in the world, but the way I see it is that we don't need to be the first responder in every situation. We don't need to be the policeman of the world. I mean, I think that's fundamentally the mistake. And if you look at what we did in World War I or World War II, one of the reasons why we suffered a lot less than our allies is we were late to the conflict. We weren't the first responder. We were the last responder. We were basically the balancer of last resort. The doctrine that I believe in is not, either liberal interventionism on the one extreme or isolationism on the other. It's called offshore balancing, where basically you do engage in balance of power logic, but you try to look to your regional allies to provide the peace first. And, that may not be what we did in World War I or World War II, may not be the most noble. We didn't rush into battle the way that the British did, but we suffered a lot less. It's just a lot smarter.
FDR was a genius. Churchill wanted him in earlier, and he was a genius. He waited. But at the height of the Cold War, Reagan spent 5.3% GDP, and we had just under 600 ships on the ocean because we are an everywhere police force on the oceans. That guarantees free trade, which allows us to prosper. And we cannot let the Chinese build a Navy base in Djibouti. We cannot allow them to have Iran as a client state. We can't allow them to threaten Taiwan. We've got to get India into the game. Vivek makes that point repeatedly. But let's just go back to Ukraine and finish this.
Reagan had a 30% debt to GDP. We have, what is it now, 120% debt to GDP?
Correct.
We're $32 trillion of debt against a $25 trillion economy. So we are much more indebted than we were in Reagan's day. Reagan had a lot more room on the credit card to engage in a defense buildup. And what we need now, I think, is just a lot smarter thinking. You mentioned number 4%. I mean, look, we're at 4% if you do the accounting.
No, we're not. 2.7.
Right.
No. We're at 2.7 because within the Pentagon, there's a lot of spending that is not on military needs. I know there's off-balance stuff, but there's also global warming and social engineering. If you get it all together, we're at about 2.5%. And I would leave you to the defense experts to do it, but we are not anywhere near where we need to be.
Well, how about we correctly budget for Ukraine? How about we correctly budget for all these other items that are downstream impacts of all these wars that we get into, whether it's VA spending and so forth? You correctly do all that budget. You correctly do the accounting. By the way, the Pentagon can't even pass an audit. They can't even pass an audit.
I agree. So But what do you do? I mean, it's easy to bitch, but what do you do?
Well,
we can't stop
being
spending.
A lot smarter, restructure. You do what a business would do. Look, a business that has been failing for 20 years, that has been recklessly spending for 20 years on the wrong things. And by the way, we haven't won any of these wars that we've gotten into.
Oh, disagree. David, where were you on 9/11?
So we've got nothing. We've got nothing for this $8 trillion that the forever wars cost us.
You're wrong.
Nothing for that. So we need some new thinking. But
that's just not correct. I'll come back and explain why David Sachs is wrong about that. I will come back. This is an important moment. I don't want to break it up with the break. I do, however, want to tell you we've got a great sponsor in Briarcliff Entertainment, and they have a new movie coming out, The Hill, which stars Dennis Quaid, one of my favorite actors, David Quaid. It's about Ricky Hill, and it's an amazing movie because he's such an amazing life story. It's a true story, not based on a true story. It's a true story. And what Ricky Hill does is inspiring and tear-inducing. He can hit the ball. He got perfect eyesight at Ted Williams' swing, and he got a degenerative spinal disease. So the question is, does playing cripple him? And how does he cope with that? And his dad's a pastor. He wants his son to be a pastor, and it's a conflict, father-son conflict, and it's an ambition versus ability conflict, and it's a risk versus reward conflict, and it's in theaters August 25th. It's rated PG. Go and get your tickets right now. It stars Dennis Quaid, Colin Ford, and Scott Glenn, and I think you will find that the entire family will love it, especially if you got a baseball player somewhere in the family. I also want to remind everyone about our friends over at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Their richstatespoorstates.com book is available. I talked with their lead economist yesterday, Jonathan Williams, and Hawaii was already struggling in those rankings. Now it's going to be way down at the bottom as the disaster in Maui, the heartrending stories that are all over the front page of this morning. Please don't forget richstatespoorstates.org, richstatespoorstates.org. Get the book and understand why your state is either thriving or dying, and the policies that can turn the dying ones into a thriving one. They've been imposed and legislated in places like Florida and Texas, and they work. They work in Tennessee, they work in Ohio, but you got to get your legislators to go and do it. Robert Oth, I know you're listening, New Jersey State Legislator. Maybe get a copy for everyone in the New Jersey State Legislature. Please also remember Food for the Poor, our campaign underway. They are great sponsors of this show. They are pre-positioning the disaster relief that is absolutely going to be necessary in this hurricane season where at least 18 storms are expected to blow through the Caribbean and into Central America. And you saw what happened to Maui. It's going to happen with no support system in Haiti and other countries except people like Food for the Poor. Please be generous at the top of HughHewitt.com. David Sachs comes right back after this. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Congressman Mike Garcia joins me. I'm going to come back to the David Sack interview in the top of the next hour. Congressman, I spent an hour and some time last night talking to David Sachs of the West Coast, you know, the All In podcast, big funder of GOP. He wants us to spend less on defense, and he wants the Pentagon turned upside down, and he's skeptical of aircraft carriers. What do you say to the neo-isolationists in the party right now?
Well, I don't disagree that we need to be more efficient with the money. We need to be more effective with the
Go ahead.
Out of that now.
Yeah, your cell phone is cutting in and out on us, Congressman. You want to try us back?
I apologize for that.
That's okay. Keep going.
Yeah, no, I was just, I understand the sentiment that we've got to be more efficient with the money for sure. We do. Whatever the number ends up being, if it's $850 billion a year, it needs to behave like $950. But to cut spending right now when we've got an adversary like China that's really got an unlimited military budget, they don't have a military-industrial complex and then a commercial sector. They just have one economy that they fully leverage across all industries for their military. So looking at the budget numbers themselves is a little misleading. And yes, they're spending less directly on their military, but they're leveraging the private sector. And right now, coming on off the heels of 22 years of global war on terror, we cannot take our foot off the pedal when it comes to military spending. We've got to be accelerating it, and we are extremely behind China. Not just in terms of capability, and in some domains we have an advantage in capability, but primarily capacity and getting the ability to produce weapons at rate in order to meet this need and actually conduct a pivot to the Pacific like we've been talking about for 15 years. And get to the readiness and presence levels in the Pacific that we absolutely need right now.
Congressman, David Sachs just threw out what is a canard on the right, which is our aircraft carriers are sitting ducks, and they can be taken out with a few missiles from China. You're an F-18 pilot. You're a veteran of every carrier out there. What do you say to that, to the people who say our carriers are now just sitting ducks?
Yeah, I think they're vulnerable to certain weapon systems, the DF-41, DF-21 systems. These are the carrier killers, if you will. But we do have defenses against them, and the offensive capability and the presence that the aircraft carriers bring is unparalleled and absolutely necessary. Now, we've got to continue to evolve the tactics. We've got to continue to evolve the electronic warfare capabilities and algorithms that we use to disturb missiles before they get off the rail and while they're in flight. And we've got to improve the defensive capabilities for the entire carrier battle group. It's not as, offensive an advantage offensively as it was maybe 30 years ago, but they aren't necessarily sitting ducks. They're extremely vulnerable, but they're not sitting ducks. And frankly, we can't afford to not have them. We've got to have that power projection from the sea in order to not only maintain a presence, but fight a war if the bullets start flying.
Now, my argument is that we've begun a 30-year transition so they don't end up like the battleships in 1941, sunk and out of the game. But that 30-year transition is to underwater submersible stuff. But we're not going to get rid of aircraft carriers. They're good for everything short of ultimate war, correct?
Yeah, they are the reason why there isn't war right now in some of these regions, and one of the not just the biggest deterrences, but in the first couple of nights, that's how you get your power projected across the ocean and across borders. So there's other assets. There's first night strike bomber capabilities as well as Air Force assets, but you can't conduct a war, especially on the scale of what we'd be looking at in the defense of Taiwan scenario, without aircraft carriers.
In the last minute, Congressman, out in California's 27th, what do they want you to do about Ukraine?
Well, I think it's not binary for sure. We've got our base that literally wants to spend nothing on Ukraine, and then we've got the president and his cabinet who are asking for an endless blank check, and we will do whatever we can to win. That's not a strategy. Saying we're there for you until the end, regardless of what's needed, is absolutely not a strategy. So I think what our constituents are looking for is how do we support them without it coming at the expense of our own readiness? How do we support and ensure Ukraine wins without it, cannibalizing our own capability to not only defend ourselves against China, but defend our allies in the Pacific region against China. So, there's a number in there, but it's primarily about oversight and accountability and making sure that the weapon systems that we send are being used correctly, that the dollars, if sent, are accounted for, and there's oversight from our end. And there just isn't enough of that right now. And we do need more accountability and oversight as to what's going on. I don't think the average American knows who's winning the war in Ukraine or even what's going on. I don't think the average member of Congress really understands what's going on in Ukraine. So this executive branch has not briefed the American people on what is going on in Ukraine. And at the same time, he's saying he wants whatever's necessary to make sure that they win. And we can't necessarily afford whatever is necessary for Ukraine.
Well and truly put. Congressman Mike Garcia, follow him on Twitter, or the site formerly known as Twitter, at Rep. Mike Garcia, one of California's great congressmen. Thank you, Congressman. I'll be right back. David Sachs and I continue our conversation after this.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Food for the Poor.
Good morning, America. David Sachs is one of the big four funders and activists from the West Coast in the Republican Party, joining Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and Keith Kroc. But David is sort of different. He introduced Ron DeSantis on the site formerly known as Twitter, but he's a little bit skeptical of him now, and the neo-isolationists have a voice and a very strong influencer in David Sachs. Listen to our long interview today on The Hugh Hewitt Show.
You won't want to miss a minute. This hour of Hugh Hewitt is on Salem News Channel.
Morning Glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Coming up at the bottom of the hour, J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, joins me. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this interview with David Sachs, which I taped last night. Want to wrap up this half hour. David and I just talked about everything. He's the founder of many companies, a capital allocator, podcaster, big deal guy in Silicon Valley. Let's go back to that interview, all of which is already posted at the Highly Concentrated Hugh podcast at iTunes. Let's return to where we are. David, we were hit on 9/11 froze. I don't like this. It's frozen. We have not been hit in the homeland except for minor attacks with bad human consequences, 11, 15, 30 people. But we have not had a 9/11 since 9/11. Bush did a good job.
That was money well spent, and I think we should protect the homeland. What we didn't need to do was stay in Afghanistan for 20 years. I think going in to basically get Al-Qaeda and get bin Laden, that was a righteous cause. I think we had justification for that. We were attacked. Iraq was based on a big fat lie or an untruth. You know, if you want, our entire reason for going in there was totally invalid. I don't know what we were doing with Syria, Libya, and
I don't know what's going on with our replay here, but let's pause for a moment and see if we can fix that, because this is an important thing to note. We did have a lot of money spent in the Middle Eastern wars, and we were not attacked. From 9/11 forward, we reoriented the entire national security apparatus of the United States to prevent being attacked again in a 9/11 fashion. And so I will come back to it. I want you to hear this. Meanwhile, AndrewandTodd.com, they are sponsors of this show. They are increasingly going to be your lender of first and last resort, because the 10-year Treasury yesterday spiked again as interest rates continue to climb. It is now at, I want to make sure I get it, 4.29% and rising. And all of the interest rates are rising, and they're going to go higher today, I would guess. It's a guess. It's not a prediction, because China is in such economic woes. So if you have to move, I mean, if you're getting transferred, you got to go buy a house, or you've got to leave California because it's falling apart around your ears, or you've got to get to Tennessee and save the money that you won't be paying in taxes, go to AndrewandTodd.com, 888-888-1172, 888-888-1172. AndrewandTodd.com have taken care of me and my family. They've taken care of Dwayne. They've taken care of lots of people in Salem and thousands of listeners to the Hugh Hewitt Show. And they will take care of all your mortgage needs, your refinance needs. And if you're a senior citizen and you want to investigate a reverse mortgage to put some cash in your money without ever making another, cash in your pocket without ever making another mortgage payment, AndrewandTodd.com is it. Please also don't forget our Food for the Poor campaign. At the top of HughHewitt.com, you will see the Food for the Poor banner, emergency relief supplies. Thousands of you have stepped up to help prepare for this awful hurricane season, including, oddly enough, a tropical storm aimed at Southern California, the first in my memory. Not going to be a big deal, not going to be a big blow, but it's going to be unusual. It's a precursor of what's going to be one righteous hurricane season. So your donations to Food for the Poor and the emergency banner at the top of HughHewitt.com are deeply appreciated. Can we try again with more David Sachs? Or not? Someone? Generalissimo. I don't know what you did. Did you throw down the transcriber in anger and break it?
No, I did not. I've been just about got David Sachs typed.
Well, I'm very happy about that. Will that go into your myphdweightloss.com reduction budget? I mean, does that help you lose weight?
Yeah, because the 3 hours I've spent typing this is 3 hours I can't eat.
There you go. And then you've got 2.5 hours typing Tristan Harris coming up.
Yeah, don't remind me.
Caramel corn for you today.
No caramel corn for me today. I talked to my nutritionist, Rachel, yesterday.
Oh, what did she say?
She thinks I'm doing just fine. She thinks that even though I kind of blew it over the weekend, she says you're doing exactly the steps that I would tell you to do, which is just kind of shift
you're back
into,
at 195, so I can't give you a grade. You didn't go above 195 yesterday, did you?
I did not.
You see, Dwayne lost 45 pounds, and I added 5
I lost
pounds.
50.
I know. I was telling the story. I was giving you due credit.
Okay.
Then he went down to 50. Then he bounced back around between 50 and 45, but he crossed the Mendoza line, 195, when he went to Dollywood, and he just got back. But if you need help with your diet, myphdweightloss.com, 864-644-1900. That's
864-644-1900.
Back to work with you on the galley, the typing galley. Let's go back to my conversation. Oh, okay. We're not going to be able to get it in here. Well, then we got to reset everything. Let me go and play for you Joe Biden yesterday at the White House. Cut number 2 on the second anniversary of the fall of Kabul, the day after it. This is what Joe Biden said. Cut number 2.
Important thing I want to say today is thank you, America. Thank you, Americans. We faced some tough times in recent years, but you, the American people, didn't give up. You're the ones getting up every single day going to work. You're the ones taking the risks, opening the doors, hiring workers, fulfilling dreams. And all we hear from our friends on the other side of the aisle is what they claim is what's wrong with America. Well, let me tell you.
You know, I don't, what's going on with our computer? Did it fry? Did it just die? I'm going to try one more. Governor Gavin Newsom lecturing parents yesterday in California, cut number 8.
I don't know
or not.
What their assertion is specifically. What's their? I heard one of them on TV.
Well, you better reboot the whole thing and find where we are on David Sachs. In the meantime, let me tell you folks about the appeals court ruling last night. The Fifth Circuit had on appeal the district court decision enjoining the distribution nationwide via the mail and without doctor consultation of the abortion pills. And it was a much criticized ruling. It followed in the wake of Roe v. Wade, and the ruling suggested that the Food and Drug Administration and Judge Matthew Kaczmarek made it had been rushed, and their regulatory improvisations that did away with the need to consult a doctor were not appropriately done. And yesterday, the Fifth Circuit upheld that decision in large part. Restrictions on the abortion pill are now in place. I do not know. In fact, I doubt that the Supreme Court will immediately jump into this with a what they call the secret docket. It's not a secret, but an action by the 9 to enjoin the cases and joining of the FDA's rules about the availability of the abortion pill. But some people expect that they will do that. Some people expect that they will, in fact, not allow the regulations to be imposed on the distribution of the abortion pill. Last big story of the morning, and the one I want to alert you to, and hopefully we'll get the rest of the David Sachs interview in. It's all posted, by the way, over at Highly Concentrated Hugh. The entire video is posted at hughhewitt.com. We're just having a little trouble when we try and do too many things at once here, and we did an on-the-fly deal in the last hour, which I think may have screwed us up completely. The thing I want to tell you about is China, and I want you to focus on China today. There is a run on the bank, but the bank is all of China. So investors are fleeing China for the reasons that they fled Silicon Valley Bank months ago. They do not have visibility into the balance sheet of the country, not just a bank, but of the country. And it's finally dawned on investors they cannot trust the Leninist regime, which has taken hold completely and in an obvious fashion and is not telling you the truth. And youth unemployment has spiraled. Interest rates were artificially lowered. And buildings contractors, the big developers in China, are falling like dominoes. So they have a 2008 on their hands. Remember our own fiscal financial panic? They now have a panic in China. And they're doing everything they can to stop that. I wouldn't be surprised to see if we see some expert controls put on by the course of the end of the day. But it will not be successful, even if they try. And so watch the China space very, very closely this morning. We have a lot of audio, but I hope we can play it when we come back from break. We'll reset the computer. Sometimes it burns out on us. We did a funny trick last hour because we're just going to restart the whole thing and find out where we were in the David Sachs interview and play as much of it as we can for you in the remaining 2 segments of this hour before J.D. Vance comes along. So don't go anywhere, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I'll be right back. In the meantime, if you want to listen to the entire David Sachs interview uninterrupted, head over to Highly Concentrated Hugh. And if you want everything in the universe and you want to text me in the text that I read, subscribe to the universe. You get every minute of every radio show for the last 24 years. Plus, you get a conversation with me and you hear from me about various things on the universe via the subtext function. Stay tuned. I'll be right back. From Studio North, I'm Hugh Hewitt.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show brought to you by Sierra Pacific Mortgage. For more info, call 888-888-1172.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Let's go back to my interview with David Sachs. We got the audio and video fixed.
So we need some new thinking. But
That's just not correct. That's just not correct.
Hugh,
David, we were hit on 9/11. We have not been hit in the homeland except for minor attacks with bad human consequences, 11, 15, 30 people. But we have not had a 9/11 since 9/11. Bush did a good job.
That was money well spent, and I think we should protect the homeland. What we didn't need to do was stay in Afghanistan for 20 years. I think going in to basically get al-Qaeda and get bin Laden, that was a righteous cause. I think we had justification for that. We were attacked. Iraq was based on a big fat lie or an untruth. You know, if you want, our entire reason for going in there was totally invalid. I don't know what we were doing with Syria, Libya, and so forth. Ukraine, we could have easily avoided this conflict. And yet we keep blundering into all these wars that then cost all of this money. And then, you know, people come along and say, well, our big mistake is not spending enough. Come on. We need to start being a lot smarter. We need to start being smarter about avoiding these conflicts. There's no reason to get into all of them. We, again, instead of being the first responder, we need to let our allies do some of the work and carry some of the burden. And then we need to spend the money in the right ways. The last thing we need to do is really increase the budget. I'm not saying we have to cut it, but we need to spend that money in much smarter ways.
Okay. I'm worried that Ron will listen to you. If he's the president of DeSantis,
I don't think he will. I'm not that important, so don't worry.
I want to close by asking you about NATO, because you've taken a couple of shots at it. I'm very glad Poland's in NATO. Very, very glad. I'm very glad that Sweden and Finland are in NATO. Not too sure about Romania. Not too sure about Hungary. Certainly don't know about the Balkan nations. But frontline nation, what would you do? We've signed a treaty with them. That's a treaty, NATO treaty. If the Wagner Group mercenaries invade Poland, will our people shoot them, and ought they to?
Yeah, look, what's done is done. Is water under the bridge. They're members of NATO. We're not going back. So yes, we are going to defend NATO countries. I think we have that obligation to do it, and I think we would. One thing I would tell you, though, is we need to keep those countries, especially Poland, on a pretty tight leash, because they've been engaging in a lot of bellicosity towards Russia. There's been quite a bit of talk about them even going into Western Ukraine. And the last thing we need them to do is to start a direct war with Russia that would involve NATO. And
I don't think there's any danger of that. And I would agree with you if I thought there was a danger of that. We do not want any single NATO troop to be involved in direct combat with the Russians. But last question, if Putin were to win in Ukraine, what do you think he would, and stop, not engage Poland, not cross the border Romania, stop there. But if he were to win, topple Zelensky, what do you think the country would look like in 3 years?
Well, I think some version of this is actually going to happen, because I think that we are going to fight the last Ukrainian. We're not going to engage in diplomacy. We're not going to make peace. And I agree with, Professor Mearsheimer's analysis of what's likely to happen, which is the Russians are going to win this war. It's a war of attrition in which they have 4 or 5 times the manpower that the Ukrainians do. They have many times the artillery that the Ukrainians do. And there's nothing that the U.S. can do to fix that within the next few years, because we've hollowed out our industrial production. And that's been, I think, one of the shockers of this war, is just how depleted our stockpiles are. I think it's insane.
So what do you think the Russians will do if they win and occupy the country?
Well, I don't think they're going to – they don't want to occupy the entire country because, again, like Mearsheimer says, it'd be like swallowing a porcupine. Western Ukraine is filled with Ukrainian nationalists who are incredibly hostile towards Russia. And the last thing they want to do is try and govern all those people who are inimically or hostile towards Russia. So I think that ultimately what Russia's going to do is what Mearsheimer said, which is that they're going to try to get to a defensible point, which is probably the Dnieper River. They might try to take Odessa. They might try to take Kharkiv if they can. And then I think they'll stop. And I think they will.
What will they do
Ukraine
to the people under their control? Because Mearsheimer is not an authority with me. I think he's absolutely wrong on almost everything, but I don't want to argue that with you. I just want to know what you think Putin will do to the people of Ukraine. If you are right, and he is right, and they advance to some line that they consider sufficient, what will they do to the people behind that? And ought we to care?
Well, I think the sad reality is that I think that where we're likely to end up if we don't use diplomacy is, and so this is not just Putin doing it. We have agency too. We could engage in diplomacy. We could work to resolve this conflict. But I think that where we're going to end up is that this slow grinding war of attrition will continue. The Russians fundamentally have the advantage in that. They have more men, more artillery, and the Ukrainian counteroffensive is not going anywhere. We don't seem to have the weapon systems that can really make a difference in this. We can talk about that if you want. But fundamentally, I think the Russians are going to win this war. Again, it'll be a slow grinding victory. And
pause it right there. We'll come back and hear the conclusion of my conversation with David Sachs. Do remember we're in the ReliefFactor.com studio, and I remind you once an hour, do not leave home without it. If you're exercising today or you're aging today. And guess what? You are getting older today, and those aches and pains get more and more frequent, more and more irritable. But you don't have to put up with them. ReliefFactor.com. Icarian curcumin, resveratrol, and omega. The only natural supplement I take. In the last 23 years of a 24-year show, I've taken one supplement. ReliefFactor.com. I just generally don't go out of the way for them. But this thing works, and that's why I take it. And I've kept up my 10Ks, and I've kept up my trundling, and I just feel great. And it doesn't fix broken arms. It does not replace hips that have got to replace or knees that have broken. But it does help in the reduction of inflammation, which causes pain. So give it a shot. $19.95. Get you a 3-week starter pack at ReliefFactor.com from this beautiful ReliefFactor.com studio. I'll be right back with the conclusion of today's interview with David Sachs. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. Here's the conclusion of my interview with venture capitalist, capital allocator, podcaster, and rising force in the GOP from Silicon Valley, David Sachs.
They're going to win ugly. It's going to, and what that will look like is I think that Ukraine will be reduced to a rump state. It'll basically just be the western portion of the country, the eastern part of the country that has a lot of ethnic Russians in it, the Russian diaspora. I think that's the part that Putin is interested in. I do not think they're going to try and govern Ukrainians. I think they're going to try and govern this eastern portion of the country. And I think the sad reality is that I think that Western Ukraine is going to become like the Palestine of Europe, or like the Palestinians. They're going to be left in this limbo state of not having full statehood, basically.
But the Israelis do not do a buka. The Israelis do not export 16,000 Palestinians and turn them into Jews. The war crimes that Russians have amassed, that nobody argues. They've done war crimes and they're on the record. Do you think he'll stop, or do you think he'll escalate that? And that the vengeance would be extreme and ongoing and we would stand by and do nothing? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that questions of war crimes are determinations that should be made by objective third parties after the war. It's very hard. It's hard to make those determinations in the heat of battle because both sides have propagandists who want to basically inflame and inflate those claims. So things like Bucha need to be investigated by objective third parties after the war, and then we can make those determinations. But look, my take on it is that the Russians have defined objectives in Ukraine. They want to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. They want to demilitarize it. They do not want it to be a military threat on their border. They said denazification, which you can treat as propaganda, or you could see it as removing that Azov element from the Ukrainian regime.
David, you have
these are their objectives, okay? And I do not think that they want to engage in genocide. I think that's hyperbole. And when Zelensky went to the Knesset,
they are systematically exporting children from Ukraine without their parents, 16,000 of them. Bucha is not up for grabs. That happened. We've got the evidence and everyone knows it. And Putin is nuts. And he's also a paranoid, and he's also surrounded by yes men, and he's got the Wagner Group crazies, and he's got nukes. I really don't believe...
This is all the more reason to engage in diplomacy. I don't understand these people who say Putin is a madman. He's nuts. Let's keep escalating this war against him.
Why don't we want to
defuse it before we get to World War III?
Escalating would be to go to Russia. Pushing him back beyond his invasion from 2014 would not be. But David, I think we've come to the conclusion where we're not going to agree on this, but I'd like you to come back in 6 months and let's see where we are. But on the defense side, we really have to buy a lot of ships. We have to buy a lot more of the Navy triad, and we have to get smart about Taiwan. And I know that you talk to all these guys. They all come and speak to you on the air. Talk to them about defense and do it in a fairly serious, sustained way. I have a last question. What is China's ambition in the world, do you think?
Whose?
China's. Xi Jinping and the party.
I think that great powers behave in a certain way, Hugh, and I think that China basically will behave like a great power, which is that they will seek to translate their economic strength into military strength. They want to be safe. They want to be secure. Great powers tend to be paranoid about the intentions of other states. And I think that once they translate their economic strength into military strength, they're going to try to, I mean, this is sort of the Mearsheimer realist view of the world.
Mearsheimer's not a realist, but go ahead.
They're going to try and translate that military strength into a type of regional hegemony. They're going to try and be the dominant power in Asia. I do not think that necessarily means they want to conquer other countries and rule them, because I don't think that's consistent with Chinese culture and history. But I do think they want to be the dominant power in Asia. And I don't think it's because they're like fundamentally evil. I just think that's because great powers do tend to act that way. That's what the U.S. did in creating a Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. So, over time, they're going to seek to assert their own Monroe Doctrine, which, by the way, is also, in a way, what this Ukraine war is about, is that Russia wants to be recognized as a great power, and they want to have some influence over threats on their own border. They do not want a hostile military alliance, the United States setting up shop on their own border. I think China has that same objection as well. And over time, they will probably try and seek to push us out of Asia.
That's
probably
true,
something.
But they are. You don't think they're a fundamentally evil regime? They're a Leninist regime. They put 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps. They seized Tibet, destroyed the culture. They are an evil regime.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of communism, Hugh, or the Communist Party. I'm just saying that I think the behaviors that we're talking about are fundamental to great powers. So I just think that as states become more powerful, they do seek to achieve a more secure situation in their neighborhood. I mean, I think that's the.
Well, you mentioned earlier the Thucydides trap that we're in, and
yes.
I'm blanking. And so, do you think that's inevitable because that ends up in conflict? And only once it didn't, when Great Britain was replaced by the United States, did the rising power not get into a war with the falling power. But if we're the falling power and they're the rising power, conflict will happen. Should we shy away from that, or should we prepare for it?
Well, probably both. I mean, it's an excellent book. I think Graham Allison's right. I think it's very consistent with the realist view of the world and the Mearsheimer view of the world. I know you're not a fan of his, but he correctly saw this. He correctly saw 20 years ago that China would not rise peacefully, that as it gained economic strength, it would seek to translate that into military strength and ultimately seek some sort of regional hegemony and push the United States out of Asia. That view that I think everybody now has, or many, many people have, he predicted 20 years ago. So I think maybe you need to give him a little bit more credit. But look, I think that, all right, where were you? I lost my train of thought here.
Just that he's evil, and what should we prepare for a conflict in order to deter a conflict? And that means spending a lot more money.
Yeah, look, I think the reason why Graham Allison wrote that book is because of the historical pattern. I think that he does not want to see us get into a war that the United States could lose that could basically end the world. I mean, the U.S. and China getting into a war would be a disaster. I mean, we're talking about the potential end of the United States. We could lose that war. It could turn into nuclear Armageddon. So we should be doing everything we can to avoid that war. And I think that if you read his recommendations in that book, obviously the United States being strong and creating deterrence and creating, a balancing alliance, a balancing coalition in the region is part of what we should do. But also, he clearly recommends giving more weight to Chinese interests over time as they get stronger. And so if we're only bellicose, if we're only belligerent, if we are never willing to see the Chinese point of view, if we do not have strategic empathy, we will blunder into a war with them that could be the end of the United States. So, look, I believe in peace through strength, but I also believe that we have to be smart, we have to be strategic, and we have to have judgment. My big problem with the neocons is whenever somebody wants to exercise judgment, they accuse them of being weak. It's not weak to exercise judgment. It's smart.
Oh, I don't think it is. I don't think we ought to get in a conflict over whether or not they build a naval base in Namibia or whether they're there in Djibouti with us. I don't want a shooting war. But the number one thing, and I don't think it's right to call Cotton or Gallagher a neocon, because neocons are associated with eager for war. Reagan was not. Reagan invaded Grenada. That was it. But he deployed Pershing 2s to Europe. He deployed cruise missiles to Europe, and he got a 600-ship Navy. That which has traditionally projected American strength has been naval power and a willingness to engage our allies and fortify them. If we did that, we'll be fine, including drawing India maybe into our coalition, like Vivek says. And, let's just leave it there, David, because we are in general.
Two quick points, if I could, Hugh. So first of all, I think technology constantly changes. And we've seen now from this Ukraine war the importance of drones and the asymmetric nature of the warfare where a $1,000 drone can destroy a $5 million tank. I think a lot of the boats that you're talking about are floating ducks or sitting ducks. And I think we really have to think about that. I don't know if we have a good way to protect them from Chinese missiles. So I think we really have to think through that, whether that strategy is still the best way of protecting power.
We do. That was the conclusion of my interview. I think David Sachs is a fascinating guy. He's going to come back. I'm not going to assess the interview with him not being here. I'll just ask you to go and read the transcript, which Generalissimo is posting at this moment. The video and audio are all posted at HughHewitt.com. The podcast is already up at Highly Concentrated Hugh. doing this a little bit out of order because the emphasis was on getting the content to you this morning and getting your attention paid to it, because not a lot of people inside the Beltway pay attention to anyone outside of the Beltway. And I live, half my life outside of the Beltway, up north, out west. I try and get out of the Beltway as much as possible. I go to places like the American Legislative Exchange Council. I listen to podcasts by new voices like David Sachs. I stay in touch with what Dennis Prager's doing on the West Coast or Charlie Kirk is doing in Arizona. I think the Beltway can be completely distorting of one's point of view. But I also believe in reading history and knowing knowing history. And there's not a little bit in me that thinks, unless you've spent 30 years doing this. And I often like to say, have you ever had a clearance? I didn't ask David that because it would have been unfair. I doubt he's from his resume, I don't think he's ever had a clearance. And when you have a clearance and when you see what the other team does, and the team that I was up against in the 80s where the USSR and the CCP is much better, you tend to worry a lot more, a great deal more, about what's going on in the world and what's going on at home and our weakness and the need to rebuild. And I know I've already heard from the Ron Paul faction, the complete, go back on the gold standard and don't spend anything on defense and have open borders people. That's not David Sachs. David Sachs is not an isolationist. But if you fall in love with John Mersheimer, you're going to fall in love with a lot of bad stuff. A lot of bad stuff. And so that's not the guy to fall in love with. If you're going to say Victoria Nuland somehow represents American foreign policy in the Bush years, that's simply wrong. W did that. W and Cheney and one advisor on their staff does not a neocon administration make. No one attacked the United States after 9/11 because we went to Afghanistan, we went to Iraq. And we had one Iraq. It had been secure and stabilized because of the surge when President Obama made a premature withdrawal. And we had to go to Syria as a result of ISIS, which came after we left Iraq. So it's important to understand what actually happened, not what you like to think would happen. I don't think David did that, but I think a lot of people do that. So please send around the audio to people, send around the link and have them look, because David matters a great deal, like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and Keith Kroc, sort of the four Republican, the kings of hearts, queens, diamonds, and spades out of Silicon Valley, though they've moved on to different places. I'm coming back with J.D. Vance, another Silicon Valley, but a Marine and a senator, and he's from Ohio. Stay tuned.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Regnery's The People's Justice, Clarence Thomas, and the constitutional stories that define him.
Welcome back, America. The audio, the transcript, and the video of my long conversation last night on the East Coast, late yesterday afternoon on the West Coast with David Sachs, entrepreneur, capital allocator, venture capitalist, call him what you will. He's a major influence on the Republican Party internal debate about national security. That's all posted now at hughhewitt.com because of the more extraordinary efforts of Generalissimo Adam and Harley. The podcast is also posted over at Highly Concentrated Hugh. If you joined the universe, you could listen to everything I've ever done with anyone, and you're more than welcome to go do that. And you could use subtext to tell me what you thought about it. I'm going to go over there and see if anyone's actually already told me what they thought about it. Because subtext, the great thing about it is it works instantly, and I don't get a chance to check it very often. Oh, here we go, Wendy. David Sachs' interview was interesting. Let me see here. I got to get all the way down. We want to make order out of chaos. Recent history, we are deconstructing or disrupting current world order. Reagan sized up the world and concluded we win. We are in different times with confused leaders. West is obsessed with climate, which in my view lends itself to the West to be duped. I think we have J.D. Vance now. Yeah. Hey, good morning, Senator. How are you?
Good, Hugh. How you doing?
Good. I spent an hour and 10 minutes with David Sachs last night, and that interview is over at my podcast and my website. He a friend of yours?
He is. Yeah, he's a really good guy.
Very smart guy. I call him a neo-isolationist. What do you think of his views on Ukraine, China, and our defense spending?
Well, David and I sort of agree on the Ukraine question. I actually don't know his views on China or the broader defense question, but where I think he's basically right is that we don't have the industrial capacity because we've made a lot of bad decisions to focus on China and Ukraine simultaneously. We have either the Russian threat, we have the Chinese threat, and we can defend Ukraine or we can defend Taiwan, but I don't think that we can defend both with the current weapons production capabilities that we have. So in that world of limited resources, every time that we add another $25 billion to the amount that we're giving Ukraine, we are actually, without realizing it, making a decision to not focus on the East Asia theater. So I think he's right about that, and he and I have sort of had a lot of good conversations to that effect. I know you're on the other side of that, Hugh, but I really think that we have to ask ourselves, how long can we keep going with this?
And that's a little bit different from how he stated it, but I would recommend the podcast to you. He's a very smart guy. But I'm of the belief that we fix it by raising spending on defense dramatically back to Reagan levels of 5.3%. I am curious if you would do what Vivek did this week, which is draw a red line, a hard red line around Taiwan, but then promise to erase it as soon as we have semiconductor independence by 2028 or 2029.
Well, my question on the hard red line, I mean, look, I think we should defend Taiwan. I think that if the Chinese took Taiwan, it would be catastrophic. But look, let's be honest with ourselves and let's be realistic here. If the cost of defending Taiwan is 500,000 American lives, then of course we don't do it. The political will isn't there to do it. There's obviously no capacity for us to even, I think, devote that level of military resources to the island. If, however, we can increase the cost of China invading Taiwan, I think that's fundamentally has to be American policy here, is make it so costly they don't do it in the first place. And to do that, you really have to provide them with sufficient defensive weapons so that, they have hell to pay crossing the sea in the first place. And then once they try to establish a beachhead, likely in the southern part of the island, they have the sufficient artillery and other munitions to beat these guys back. So I think that's how you deal with the problem. I don't know how you can create a real red line without obviously committing America to potentially losing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Some very off-the-record defense people tell me we have submersible, non-signatory ability to sink their Roros, and that they can't blame us because we can't be traced. If that's true, should we use them?
Oh, of course we should. Of course we should. We should absolutely be willing to defend Taiwan against the Chinese attack. And I think that's a pretty broadly shared view within the Republican Party. But I also think that we have to be realistic. The best thing that we can do to defend Taiwan is to provide them sufficient defensive capabilities now, not after the Chinese have invaded. After the invasion starts, God forbid when that happens, our capacity, Hugh, is really limited. I mean, it's right next door to China. We obviously have allies in the region, but they're not even that close to Taiwan. We have limited capabilities with next-generation fighters. The fighter that we have I think it's the best fighter in the world, but it also has limited range. relative to some of our adversaries. So we have to be realistic here. And the simple fact is the best way to prevent China from taking Taiwan is to prevent the invasion from happening at all. Once it happens, America is at a huge strategic disadvantage.
True. Last question. We got less than a minute. Do we need a new Goldwater Nichols? Because we got 2 million civilian employees at the Pentagon, 1 million people in uniform, and no ability to contract, follow through, or in any way audit what the Pentagon is buying and how badly it's buying it.
Yeah, I think we do. I think we need a massive reform to our defense procurement process, Hugh. I mean, if you look at the amount the Chinese are paying to build a ship, it's depending on the estimate between 15 to 25% of what it's costing us to build a ship. And some of that's labor cost. Obviously, labor is cheaper in China, but most of that is things completely unrelated to labor where they should not have such an advantage over us. So we have a very, very messed up defense procurement capacity, and we need to look into why.
I hope you go in. I hope you do. In fact, the first big swing any Republican president ought to take is transforming the Pentagon into a modern business of the sort David Sachs wishes is there but isn't. J.D. Vance, always a pleasure to talk to you, Senator. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow, America, with Tristan Harris, who is the guy behind the AI dilemma and the social dilemma. As the big interviews keep coming during August, when there's not much going on, I'll bring you the stuff you got to know going into the debate. Stay tuned.